Hello and welcome to this very special interview panel. It's a video, whatever. We're here to to have a good time as part of the Tabletop Gaming Virtual Spring Showcase. I'm Matt Jarvis. I'm the editor-in-chief of Dicebreaker. We are a board game and tabletop RPG website and YouTube channel. You can find us over at dicebreaker.com and youtube.com/dicebreaker or on Twitter at @joindicebreaker. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Cole Wehrle, designer of the hour, of the month, of the year, of the last few years in many ways, who will be familiar to many of you watching, I'd imagine, from Root, from PAX Premiere perhaps, maybe from John Company, and also for Cole's latest and upcoming game, Oath, Chronicles of Empire and Exile, which we are here today to discuss. Hey Cole, thanks for joining me.
I'm very happy to join you, and thanks to the Tabletop Gaming Spring Expo. It's nice to have a chance to sit down and to kind of take a break and take a look at Oath, which I hadn't really been thinking about because I've been in like Root land working on the new Kickstarter and everything, which will I think have wrapped up by the time this airs. But it's nice to sort of take a breath and think about something else for a little bit.
I can imagine. It seems like it's been an incredibly busy few years. Root didn't come out that long ago in the grand scheme of things, and it feels like you've constantly had projects on the go since, and not small projects either. They've always been these very kind of ambitious, impressive things. So I think let's kick off with, for those who might be watching, like I said, they might know you from Root, they might know you from some of your previous games, but they may not have come across Oath before. So if you wouldn't mind, do you mind just kind of summing up what Oath is and kind of what players do in Oath?
So Oath is a game that's being published by Leader Games, which is the primary company that I work for. It has, in a lot of ways, it's similar to Root. It has the same creative team behind Root, same artist, same style of production, but it's a very different kind of game. For one thing, it's larger. I have my copy sitting right here, and I wish I would have grabbed a copy of Fort or Root for scale, but it's big. It's a giant big box, and it is a very different kind of game from the other things that we've published. It's built around a system whereby when you win a game, instead of the game being over, how you won the game forms the start state for the game that follows it. So it's a political game at its core, and so you can imagine playing a game of Twilight Imperium or a game of Thrones maybe. But when that player gets to 7 castles or whatever you need to win a Game of Thrones, imagine that the next game takes place in a world where one player has sort of taken control of the whole map, and the other players are kind of existing in and around that kingdom. We're calling these chronicle games, but this isn't an established genre. It's kind of an experiment. Oath kind of began with this very simple question when it came to the design, which is what if how a player wins is much more important than who wins? And the whole game kind of built out from that. Now that's all very high-minded, and so the other way that I like to explain Oath very simply is that Oath is a political roguelike. So if you've played roguelike games, you're gonna recognize a lot of the design techniques in Oath because the game is very sandboxy and open, and there are lots of different kind of like strange tools that you can interact with. But like every good roguelike, the joy of the game is in the unintended consequences.
Fantastic. And it's worth clarifying because folks might be thinking of things like Pandemic Legacy and legacy games like that, where the outcome of one game kind of has an effect on future games in the series. And Oath is kind of that, but also kind of not that, right? It seems to have a knock-on effect, but it's not. You're not tearing up cards. It's not a permanent kind of state change.
Yes, there is no so there's no permanent alteration of the game. At any time, I could take a box of Oath that might be 20 or 30 plays in, and I could revert it back to its first state, or I could do a random seed and revert it to kind of any state. Moreover, there is no endpoint. So, when I think about a traditional legacy game, legacy games are usually built on these big narrative kind of branching trees. And so every corner of the game has been written and curated in some way. Oath isn't like that. I have no idea the kinds of games that people are going to be playing with Oath and the kinds of stories they're going to tell. There's nothing scripted, and there's no particular endpoint. So the engine is built so that you could play a single box of Oath 100 times. Now, that game will start getting very strange, but because the players are controlling the strangeness, they can kind of create their own sorts of circumstances as they go through.
And you say you kind of approached Oath with that kind of core, I guess, question or idea in mind. So how did you, I guess, go from just having that idea of, I guess, like this kind of living memory of a board game to what's in the box now? You know, how did you build around that and go, okay, we've got this idea of things will continue on, but this is kind of the nuts and bolts gameplay. This is what we want turn to turn, as opposed to the longer over 5, 10, 50, 100 games.
Well, I usually, when I'm working on a game project, I'll often have like a very simple idea that will, or some kind of question. It's usually not like an idea for a game. It's just it's sort of a question or an investigation I'm doing about something relating to a game. And oftentimes these cook for a long time. Like it might be a year or so that I'm just in the back of my mind. I'm working on other projects, but I'm just kind of thinking about this like essential question. And Oath was like that. I actually started thinking about Oath in earnest right after we finished Root. So we finished Root in very early 2018. And after we were working on Root, I was thinking a lot about king making and about the ends of games. And one thing that has always dissatisfied me is that I've played a lot of political games, and king making is a really important element to those political games. I mean, in some ways, when you play a Game of Thrones or a game like that, the whole trick of the game is making sure that someone else helps you win, because you can't do it alone. Now, that's a very unsettling thought, because you want to believe that you won because of your own guile and not because somebody at the last moment got bitter and pushed you into the chair. But if you think about all the great stories around kingmakers and fantasy and in history and everything like that, that is the essential question. It's about how to put yourself in a position where you can benefit from the tide of history or something like that. And games are really bad at this, because any moment that I've almost won a big, long game and someone else has propped up someone, I recognize that gives me like a bad feeling. But it also is very true to the story and the theme of the game. And so I just started thinking about, like, is it possible to design a game where that kind of king making was sort of an essential part of the game? And so I started thinking about this question of a game where the manner of victory was more important than who won. And this is like, it's so strange as you ask this question. I'm a long way away from thinking about like, oh, I want an infinite legacy game or like an infinite chronicle game. I haven't, that hasn't even entered my mind, right? I mean, at this stage, I'm just trying to think about like, is there a way to make a game that is somehow sensitive to its own endings? And so out of that, I just started thinking about consequences, right? Like if you win a game by doing something horrible and dismantling a state or something and throwing the world in anarchy, there needs to be a consequence, right? And so if the game state itself could adapt to that decision, then players would start changing how they thought about the end of the game. And so, victory is still kind of the important thing that brings all of us together, but I wanted some way to kind of like weave through this sort of tricky problem. So I was stewing on all these ideas, and I was writing a piece for an academic conference on games about king making. And I realized that what happens is that victory conditions are incredibly important because they orient all the players around the goal of the game. They get us all at the same table. And everyone's had a bad experience where maybe somebody who didn't really want to play the game starts doing their own thing, and it like breaks the magic circle. It's like a violation of the contract that put us all at the table. And I started thinking about how those violations, we usually frame them as negatively, right? They like broke the immersion. But there are other violations where someone at the table stops playing by the same victory condition, but it actually like takes the game to a higher level because they are so in character and spirit, and you see this in role-playing games a lot. And so when I had that realization, I started thinking like, okay, the key thing that needs to happen here is we have to make it so that the choices in that end game inform this larger story, and we kind of need the metagame. And all that happened, I know this is a long answer, but all that happened at the same time as I was listening to players who were playing a lot of Root talking about Root. And what they would do is root doesn't advance. Every game is kind of like takes place at the same present. But when players talk about their root, they would say like, oh, back before this faction came out, we were playing it like this. And then the meta kind of changed. And I started looking at like how players talked about the Netrunner meta and other games, or even how I play a lot of online competitive games. And so all those conversations about the meta, if you just shifted your focus a little bit, they were kind of conversations about history. And so I started wondering, like, is there a game, could you engineer a game that would engage directly with the meta? And if you could do that, maybe it was a way of addressing some of these king-making problems. Now, this is incredibly circuitous. And so, but I'm trying to give you a window into how I'm kind of piecing this together, because I had this idea for a game like Oath, but it took a year of wondering, like, is this even a game? Is this some weird think piece that I want to publish on my blog? Or is it, maybe I want to make a short film? Like, this doesn't have to be a board game. And the more I worked on it, the more I thought that actually board games were incredibly well appointed to doing this kind of work, because they're kind of like they've got 1 foot in tabletop RPGs and 1 foot in more advanced game systems, the kind of stuff we see in video games. And because of that middle space, they're both rigid and adaptable, and that's exactly what you need for this kind of question.
It was a long answer, but it was a bloody good one. It's funny you say about Root. So my group and I have had a weekly Root game going on the digital version, and like you say, we are playing the kind of core factions. So there's the Eyrie, there's the Alliance, the Vagabond, and the Marquis de Cat. But we've seen that kind of like meta game come in the Alliance won too many games in a row, so they became almost they went from being the underdog to kind of being the boulder that everyone was trying to stop together at the beginning. Mm-hmm. But obviously we were starting fresh each time, so anyone that ended up with the Alliance, if we were choosing randomly, there was kind of sense of foreboding of, oh no, everyone's going to be out to get me. So a game that builds that into its own kind of life cycle and the way it's played multiple times is fascinating. But speaking of Root, obviously Root is well known for being asymmetric. Every faction plays differently. And in terms of Oath, there are kind of elements of that in the Chancellor and the Exiles and the Citizens, who have slightly different powers, not to the degree of Root, but they're different kind of positions in the world and kind of around the table as well. Is that something you went in deliberately kind of, intrigued to explore more of the idea of having players have different powers, or was that something that just, again, developed as you were, I guess, exploring this space of how the game would evolve over multiple plays?
So at Leader Games, there's this interest in asymmetry. A lot of the games that we've done as a studio have been incredibly asymmetric. But it's always at the service of something else. We like asymmetry gives us access to certain kinds of stories that you can't tell if you just have symmetrical player positions. And I always make sure to couch things that way, because asymmetry is very expensive when it comes to the game's complexity budget, is what I sometimes think of it like. If I'm going to make an asymmetric game, I know there are lots of things that my game can't do, because I'm going to be spending a lot of rules and a lot of overhead and a lot of headache doing that. When we started working on Oath, it was very clear that building a game that could meaningfully adapt and could be played 20 or 30 times and generate, dozens and dozens and dozens of good stories, puts a big demand on the game system. And so the kind of sharp starting asymmetry, the baked-in asymmetry you see in Root, was never going to be totally on the table for Oath. But there is some core asymmetry. So players basically start in one of 3 positions. They can be the Chancellor, who is the player who won the previous game. And they start with a headache. They own all this territory. They have all these liabilities. And then they have to deal with these other players, many of whom will be playing Exiles, which are just like deposed kings, people on the outside of power, who are trying to chip away at the Chancellor's position. Now, the Chancellor is playing for time. They win if they can hold on long enough, deep enough into the game that there'll be chances of them winning each turn, that the game just kind of continues going on. But if the Chancellor gets overwhelmed, they can make offers of citizenship. And this is a very strange offer, and it's not seen in many games. But the way it works is the chancellor can give something to a citizen, a powerful item, or make some deal, and that enfranchises, sorry, can give it to an exile, that enfranchises the exile. All of their lands convert to the chancellor's color, and now the chancellor is kind of playing a shared player position, where they and the citizens are working together. Of course, only one of them is going to be the next chancellor, and so now they're being engaged on a succession condition. So the chancellor can say, I'm going to trade security of my kingdom for the liability that you might be the next chancellor. So there's like, do I want an external fight or an internal fight? And those citizenships carry through over the game. So a kingdom with 3 citizens that stays in power will still have 3 citizens in the next game. So at the start of a game, you can find yourself like outside the kingdom, in charge of the kingdom, or inside the kingdom but plotting for the overthrow of the chancellor. Now, those positions don't have any difference of power. But you have the same actions. Everyone has basically the same actions. But they can feel very different because all of the powers, all of the special powers in Oath are derived from cards. And the Oath has about 250 different unique cards, and they are really unique. So this is not like, they aren't unique in the way that a deck of cards has 52 unique cards. These cards are wildly unique. For comparison, I think Root has 15 unique cards in its deck. And even if you play the Exiles and Partisans deck, I think it's a little bit more. I can't remember the number precisely. But it's not many because there are copies and there are crafted cards in Root and things like that. The cards in this game will push players into positions of emergent asymmetry that are almost as divergent as the asymmetry in Root. So for instance, one card a player might find, one of my favorite cards is the Vow of Peace, which if you play this card, it's a vow card, so you can never unplay it. You are stuck with it. And it means that you cannot fight. For the rest of that game, you can't attack people. But it's very hard for people to attack you. And if you have that card, your game is going to be completely different from any other game, right? In the same way that, you know, if you have, there's an item you can get called the Banner of Devotion, which makes you very good at recruiting warbands and building up your army, but your warbands never leave you. You can't drop them off to protect your territory. So it kind of turns you into this like roving army. And so, I mean, and again, that's 2 out of 250. There are lots of these different powers, and if you start stitching them together, where you're like, okay, you know, I have, it's not the Banner of Devotion, it's the Ring of Devotion. But, you know, you can say, I have the Ring of Devotion, I have this roving army, and then late in the game, I capture this, like, valuable treasure that I need, and so I'm going to choose to take the Vow of Peace, which means I'm like a former warlord who's just now more of in a nomadic position. And what we tried to do with every single card is give the card really clear narrative beats that could interact with any of the other narrative beats. So because I don't have access to proper nouns or any kind of written narrative, there's no flavor text in this game except the names of cards. So when you're doing storytelling in that way, you can't say like, oh, this is the like Ring of Xanth or something, because nobody knows what that means. And I don't want to refer people to a novel or to a bit of flavor text that's going to explain what that is. So we just have to call it the Ring of Devotion, because we need the word, like the name has to be very, very powerful. And then when we zoom out and we look at the entire card list, I try to think in terms of like a narrative system. So I want objects that are specific enough that they have heft, but also general enough that they can plug into any other narrative element, so that you could almost do like storytelling jams where you just deal random oath cards face up and try to stitch them together in a narrative. And they're all kind of built with that sort of modularity.
You mentioned earlier that you kind of at some point considered whether this was kind of a game or whether it was more of an experience for storytelling, and it seems like a lot of, you know, the way the cards are designed feed into that, like say this idea of narrative. Did you feel at any point like you had to, I guess, shape it into more of a game shape? Like you had to, you know, there are victory conditions, there are, you know, resources. Did those come about as a case of like, we can't go too, you know, we can't reshape what a game is because players might find it impossible to understand. You know, they need to have some kind of objective, they need to have some kind of aim. or was that just something that I guess came back naturally in terms of, that's how history works at some point. There are winners and losers, and time flows on, and it goes from there.
Yeah, well, it's strange. There is clarity in a game system that history never presents anyone, right? If there is a game that's being played, none of us know all the rules. That's a very good question. So one of the weirdest things about working on Oath is when you develop a game. So sometimes people will ask me, how much did a game get played before it was published? And this is always a tricky question, because one answer you can give is that usually I find that by the time a game is done, I've played it about 200 times, usually between 200 and 300, depending on the game. But that's a lie, kind of, because the game is changing in every single one of those plays. So did I play the final version of Root? Like, how many times was final Root played before we published it? And the answer to that question is like 3, 4 times. And so when you're working on a project like Oath, immediately this is an immense problem, because the whole game is hinged on, I want these chronicles that players do to last for 10, 20, 30, 40 games. And I've played hundreds of games of Oath, but I've never played in a chronicle that was that far advanced. And so there's a weird thing happening that you have an idea for how a game is going to look, the shape of the game, what you want it to do. The way, I sometimes tell people that Oath began with me thinking about how I wanted people to talk about the game when they weren't playing it. Like, it was like that meta where I'm like, don't worry about the game. The game's a black box. What are the kinds of conversations I want people to have about the black box? Now let's build a game that can sort of create that kind of conversational space. So that's the goal. But I know the realities of development are that I'm going to be playing this game a lot and it's going to be changing a lot, but I'm going to be starting over chronicles constantly. And so this actually put a very good pressure on development, because it meant that games had to be interesting as games. Every match of Oath had to be a compelling challenge. And I think this is actually one of the biggest problems that some legacy games fall into, is that they kind of save the good stuff for later. And they start and they're like a little simple and like a little boring. And it's like a TV show where someone tells you the first season's bad, and you just have to like make it through. I hate that. Like, are you kidding me? The first season's bad? We could have watched 6 movies. Instead, we're just ramping up for something that's going to be less bad because we've got all this fill. So it was really important that, like in Oath, the game starts with a little starting deck. Every one of the cards in the starting deck is like sharp and interesting and powerful, even though they're just the starting cards. We didn't want to make like an intro deck. Now, some of the later cards are a little bit more complicated, but they aren't any more, I think, players will still find themselves drafting cards from the starting set, even very, very deep into a chronicle, if they're, if those cards are still hanging around their deck. So when we were testing Oath, a lot of the tests that we did were from random seeds. So we had in our testing TTS mod, we had a button that would just like create a completely random deck. And we did that because we just needed to test all the combinations. Now, we can't test all of them. We can't even test like a meaningful section, but we can do our best. And it really made it so that we had to make sure that every match of Oath presented the kinds of players who like crunchy games with really interesting puzzles and challenges. Now, I'll add to this that Oath, one of the things that Oath has both going for it and as a detriment is there are elements of risk in the game. You're gonna take a risk and you might lose, and it might pay big. But those kind of gambits are like really essential to the whole creation of the engine. So even though when we're designing this game, we're wanting the game to be strategically and tactically rich. We also know what sort of game it is, right? Like, this is not, I just want to disabuse anybody who might be thinking like, oh, this game sounds really cool, I'm ready to like go on from Agricola. And it's like, you may not like this game because it is definitely not like an engine builder. But it's still a pretty good game in almost every circumstance. Like, you will find yourself like hatching plans and trying to execute them. And so those gameplay elements were always very, very critical. Like I never wanted the story of the game to have to carry any weight. Like I wanted the game to carry its own weight, I guess is the right way to put it.
At any point did you say kind of that, legacy games are a different beast? But at any point did you consider that maybe this would work as a legacy game? Like, were you constrained at all by the fact it needed to be replayable, hypothetically forever, rather than like, okay, we can get really wild and tear things up and have, really permanent change?
Oh, I thought it, well, so I'm really good. This is my one secret talent maybe of not doing things like that, where I'll create a little wall to work in. And the entire project, I was working on Oath, and I said that nothing will be destroyed. Absolutely, that this game sticks around forever. I don't want any pre-scripted narrative, and it didn't even enter the conversation. However, the moment I was done with Oath, the next project that I've started working on, which we haven't announced yet properly, it adapts some lessons from Oath, but it operates in a 3-act structure, so that every time you play it, you play in a 3-game like mini legacy game, and then it's over. And it is so nice to be working on things that end, because it means I can be a lot crazier and really push the design space, because I know I don't have to worry about the game healing itself. If players really break Oath has safeguards that get engaged. So for instance, as the Chancellor, you get these relics. Players always get relics in the game, or they can, which are very powerful items. And when you become Chancellor, all of your relics that you had in the previous game get locked up in your reliquary, which means you don't get to use them for the next game, and those are the gifts you give citizens to enfranchise them. Now, I like this because it's thematic and it's cute, but it also performs like a very, very critical role in the game, which is that if you find a absolutely critical combination of relics that's unbeatable, you won't get them 2 games in a row. And so Oath has a lot of safeguards like that to make sure that the game doesn't destroy itself. But now that Oath is done and I'm working on other things, it's probably not surprising that my first thing was, I definitely want to do games that end now. I'm back to that.
In fairness, I feel like a game that destroys itself could also be quite interesting.
Yeah.
Almost like a legacy game that you don't even need to touch, and it
eats itself.
Operates itself, and eventually you've just got a load of torn up cardboard.
My copy of Brass was like that. I think after we had played it maybe 30 or 40 times, you could hardly read the cards.
You mentioned a couple of answers ago about risk, and this is a bit of a deep dive, but it's something I've been intrigued by. So your games they're built around arguments, and they're built around these very interesting kind of situations between players. But in, I think, nearly almost all of your games, there's very kind of careful use of luck. So dice rolls. Yeah. So in Root, it's combat. In Oath, I think it's the end of the round to see which round the game ends on. In John Company, there's the balance of India and things like that. But it always seems to be quite carefully considered where luck comes in. Is that something that just interests you as the kind of, are you always tempted to just have that little bit of chaos in there rather than a completely hermetically sealed kind of perfect game?
So there was a designer I knew once who talked about how he always put dice in combat because dice were fun. And I hated this. He would say this all the time, and I just hated every time he said it because it seems so stupid. Because, first of all, he's right. I mean, just from an emotive aspect, people will tell you that they like rolling dice and things like that. But I think it's a bad way to design. So generally, I only put in luck when it's so all of my games. I should say something about general process. All of my games are built very system first. So I know like what the tension or the big question is and what I need the system to do, and then every mechanism is tuned to that system. So this can drive playtesters batty if they haven't worked with me before, because it means that on the mechanical level, the games are changing constantly. I thought I signed up for a worker placement game, and now it's a card drafted game. And I'm like, it's about the system. It's not about the mechanism. Every mechanism needs to be tuned to the system. Oath is an interesting example because it changed a lot during the course of its development. But I always knew how many cards were going to be in the game and how many what the card flow was going to be like. And so, for instance, in Oath, there is a small deck of cards that you draw from, but the mechanism of drawing is that you look at three cards, you pick one to keep, and then two of them get discarded. But in Oath, almost all the economies are zero sum. And so you don't discard them out of the game. You just discard them to a different region. And the draw pool of the game is mostly the cards that people are throwing away. And so it creates this very, it's like weirdly strategic, because you'll draw a card and you'll be like, okay, I'm now aware that these other two cards are kind of like in the mix. And if I really wanted them, I could go chase them down, but I'm going to have to spend my entire turn chasing that second card. Is that going to be the kind of gambit I want to make? Things like that. So there is some chaos, though, in the drawing of a card. But it was important to, in the context of the game, make it so that the deck was designed to offer players opportunities, but that they couldn't build their strategy around drawing the card they wanted. There are just too many cards in the game. And so what I usually tell new players when they're playing is, like, don't worry about drawing unless you have no idea what to do. Because if you draw, you're going to get an opportunity. And if you already know what you're doing, then you don't need another opportunity on the table, because that opportunity comes at a high opportunity cost. So Oath also has dice in it. All the games have dice. I think the most infamous thing of dice roll in Oath. This is the thing, and now the game's getting ready to come out, and I'm starting to think about what reviewers might say. I'm tickled by what they're going to make of Oath's in-game, which is very old-fashioned. So starting at the end of the fifth turn, if the Chancellor has their victory condition fulfilled, they roll a die, and the game ends on a roll of a 6. And if they fail the roll and they have their victory condition fulfilled on the next turn, the game will end on a 5 or 6, and then a 3 or higher, and then it always ends. So basically the odds kind of double. They go from 1 out of 6 to 1/3, and then to 2/3. Now, that's going to drive some folks crazy, but it has a very specific reason for existing, which is that it encourages players to take risks and to seize the moment. Because if you know that someone is going to end on this turn, you know that you don't need to act in a very aggressive way. But if you're not sure when the end of the game is going to be, you have to behave a lot more aggressively, and you can make gambits. I could say, look, I'm going to snatch this victory condition and try to hold it because I know there's a 1 in 6 chance that I win. And if I failed, and if I did win, it was through my guile, through my brave risk. And if I didn't win, I have now made the subsequent turn more interesting. And this was a lesson I learned playing Mark McLaughlin's The Napoleonic Wars, which is an old card-driven war game that ends on a peace roll, where at the end of each turn, you roll a die, and on a 6, whoever has the most victory points wins. And players can manipulate this die a little bit, but one of the things I love about it is it means that if I'm playing the game, I'm going to be a little bit more aggressive because I'm uncertain about what the end is. It really captures the early Romantic period very cleanly. And if I fail, so if I try to snatch the throne, or maybe I succeed, but then I fail my roll, the subsequent turn is now more interesting because my position is more exposed. And so it blocks things like turtling. And so, I'm always, I like dice. I think they're very useful, but they're always at the service of risk. So like another example that I would quickly footnote is like the use of risk in John Company. Which is, one of the comments that players sometimes give me about John Company is they want, so John Company is all about trying to retire family members and have them retire in fabulous estates. And if you don't get the retirement roll, you don't get victory points. Now, players will occasionally tell me like, oh, I really wish I could score out my position and I would just get X number of victory points for, having all the titles that I have or something. And what they miss, what they don't understand is that the uncertainty about who's going to retire and win powers the game's negotiations. And that the more certainty the scoring system is, the more certainty there is in the scoring system, the more it dries up the negotiations. And so does it mean that occasionally a player is going to win because they got lucky? Of course. But you're getting something for that price, and what you're getting is really fabulous negotiations.
You mentioned a couple of historical games there, and outside of Leader, you're obviously kind of known for historical games that are based on real life periods of time and real life situations. Whereas your work at Leader tends to be more abstracted. Root is, I've seen comparisons of like the Vietnam War and things like that, and Oath obviously has a grounding in real life history, but they are abstracted and they take place in fancy worlds of fighting
Right.
cats and birds and so on. When you come to design a game for Leader or Oath and Root particularly, you know, when you're building these kind of real world arguments, but on top of a world that doesn't exist, so you can almost make it what you need it to be. You know, how does that shape your approach to those games? Do you feel like you have to put those foundations in of, well, if this existed in real life, here's what would happen?
When I'm working on a history game, my primary goal, not my primary goal, but a primary goal, one of many primary goals, I guess it's a contradiction, is to be true to the record and to the scholarship. So when I'm thinking about, right now in John Company, I've been stewing a lot about the law system in the new edition of John Company and trying to capture like what parliamentary politics felt like at the end of the 18th century. So I'm reading a lot of books and I'm just sort of like just thinking about it. And I know that there are demands that are placed on that system because of the game, but there are also demands being placed on that system because of the historic record. And so it really limits you, and it's a powerful limitation and a useful limitation, and it gives the argument of the game more force. But when I'm working on a fantasy game, I don't have any of those limitations. Instead, I try to think about the limitations as coming from two areas. So one of them is narrative coherence, right? So when I'm working on a game with Patrick or for Patrick, I'm thinking about like, is the narrative making sense? And I think this is a place where a lot of thematic games, especially thematic games that have been designed in the last 15 years, they really fall flat. Because even though they're like trading in a lot of the tropes of a genre or something, they sometimes lack narrative coherence, right? Like, why did that actually really happen? What explains that within the system itself? And so that's a primary concern when I'm working on something like a Root or an Oath. The other demand, though, is a demand that is a little strange, but it has to do with what you might think of as like the philosophy of the game or the angle, or it's not like one thing I like about working on Root is that we're operating in a realm of political allegory, and so I can talk about things in Root that might resonate with elements of like the Vietnam War or other things, but I don't have to worry about the particularities of Vietnam. What I do have to worry about is the coherence of the vision and the system, right? And so there's a narrative coherence. There's a narrative section to that coherence. There's also a philosophical coherence to that section. And so, like when I'm working on Oath, I mean, it was so funny when I was very early working on Oath. I was reading. I can't remember the name of it. Shucks. It's this brilliant book by an Arab historian from like the 11th century or something. But it was entirely about states and how nomads come into positions of state authority and then are also removed from those positions, and the flux of like the movement from the nomads to the cities and then getting displaced by a new nomad group going back out into the hinterland and then coming through. And that work was tremendously important in shaping how I was thinking about some of Oath. And I don't, again, I'm not going to worry about Middle Eastern politics in the 9th century or something and have to think that I need to make the game accountable to them. But it does help frame and inform the game. So, when I'm working on these fantasy games, in one respect, they're very unhinged. There are a lot of different things that I can do. They also allow me to be trans-historical, which is really fun. I can like take some ideas from like the 20th century and put them in conversation with some ideas from the 8th century. And that's very exciting. But there are still demands being placed on them, and I think about their demands as like they're either philosophical or narrative.
You mentioned earlier the kind of thought process you went through in terms of determining whether Oath, could have even been a short film, or how it would best make those arguments that you were putting together. In terms of board games, particularly, have there ever been any ideas where you've just thought that's too ambitious, or it's too complex to put into a bunch of tokens and a board and some cards?
Oh yes, so many, and in fact, I'll usually kind of perform this little test when I'm working on a game, which is what kind of thing should this be? So I'll have an idea, and I'll be like, what kind of thing does this want to be? And then, am I the right person to make it? And that second question is really tricky because sometimes there's a game I would really like to work on, but I'm just not the right person to make that to do that design. And that might be because of my own subject position, or it might be because of my skill set, or any number of things, right? Like, I am not equipped to make a movie. So if I have a game idea that actually is much more of a movie idea, I'm going to probably leave that behind because I'm not equipped to execute that the way it needs to be executed. And there are lots of other good ideas out there, and nobody needs my bad movie idea. So one game, though, that I did abandon is I had this game. It was right before I got hired by Patrick. So right before I started working on Root, I was working on this game where the players were going to play historians. And the idea was that this great empire, it was going to be kind of abstract in its theming, but this great empire had collapsed, and the players were trying to figure out why it had collapsed. And so the game would be encoded with like a collapse logic that then players had to decipher what had happened. And what would make it more complicated is that as you published books, you were also trying to steer the academic discourse towards whatever truth you were heavily invested in. So it was going to be about knowledge production and how, like, the academic pursuit both allows a deepening understanding, but can also lead to blind spots because there are interests in understanding things a certain way. Now, I thought this was a dope idea for a game, and I spent a lot of time working on it, and I just couldn't get it to work. I couldn't get it to work because it needed specificity, but to design some kind of hidden logic, you had to like remove the specificity, because otherwise, think about Clue. Like the place, the person, and the weapon, but you don't know what the lighting was like. You don't know if they were surprised when they died. I mean, you don't have like a lot of the details that would make it a really vivid like murder game. And so, it's just apples and oranges and grapefruit or something, right? When you're thinking about, how the different axes of that little deduction matrix play out. So I stopped working on it because it was clear that it was just not the kind of product for me. And then I was delighted when I think last year 2 games came out that kind of worked in the same area. So you had The Search for Planet X, which kind of worked in the same area. I think it's a lovely deduction game, but it's also like very abstract and very simple, which was not what I wanted to do. And it kind of like validated my instinct of being like, okay, it would have been too simple to do the kind of game that I would have wanted to do. And then the other game was a video game called Heaven's Vault, which is a fabulous game. And I'm so happy it exists because I've always wanted to play a game like that. And it was just one of those moments where, obviously there was something good in the air that everybody was stewing on, but I would have been absolutely the wrong person to try to make that game because the game form just wasn't well suited to those questions.
I don't think I'm alone in saying that I would be fascinated to see Cole Wehrle's take on Clue.
I've been stewing on a deduction game not a deduction game. I want a murder mystery game, and I've been stewing on one for a long time, but I'm not quite sure how to do it.
You mentioned at the very start of our conversation, actually, about the kind of consideration of Oath's system and the way it works as being like maybe new genre is like overstating it, but you describe them as kind of Chronicles games. Mm-hmm. Is this a format or an idea that you are hoping or expecting to explore further in the future? Is it something that's kind of stuck with you now, and you're looking to apply it to other settings or arguments?
Yes, I think it offers us a way out of some problems that have been vexing these kinds of political games for a long time. but I'm not sure that it's the right path. So, it's funny, when we built our schedule for the coming year, we actually put in this little break, which allows us to see how Oath is received, to see if in fact this is the right way of approaching this problem. And I hope that Oath is received well, because it will make it easier for me to justify working on the game I'm working on now, which riffs on the Chronicle system, but in a closed fashion. And I think that, if Oath is at like the very high complexity, high emergent gameplay, like pole of like what we might think of as the Chronicle system, the other game that I'm working on is simpler than Root, much more jagged, not endless, but also working in kind of the same space. And so I'm hoping that like I can plant these two like poles, and that there might be a whole world of games that can kind of exist in that format. If you're interested in doing, I think for a long time, let me frame it this way. I feel like for a long time, there were several parallel conversations about what do games look like when we sit down to play a big strategy game. And what do games look like when we play an RPG together? And what do games look like when we play, a computer game like Crusader Kings that like doesn't really have an end condition but just kind of keeps going? And all of these conversations were happening in parallel with one another. And I think that they have really important things to teach each other. And Oath is kind of my effort to get those three genres around the same table and see if there might be something that they can build together. Now that might be a bad dinner party, and I fully, this is whenever Patrick asks me, if I'm excited about Oath coming out, I always tell him like I don't know what to expect. I'm very happy we got to make it, and I think my general sense is working in the game industry is a funny thing because if anyone who's taken microeconomics knows that one of those demand shifters is fashion, and there's no explaining it. And so it always feels like a cheat whenever an economist to me talks about fashion, because it just means it's something that they don't understand why it shifted. But I recognize that I work in the entertainment industry and that the main shifter we all operate under is fashion. And that means that I'm not going to get to make games forever, that at some point people will stop playing them and do something else, which is fine. But it means for the meantime that if I have a chance to make a big game like Oath, I'm going to like make it as big and as Oathy as possible. And maybe this opens up new space, and maybe it doesn't. And in either case, I'm just happy the thing got made.
Fantastic. I think that feels like a nice place to leave it.
Look at that.
Oath is out soon. It's going out to Kickstarter backers, I think, as of this going
Yeah,
up.
it is. I think it is on the water. By the time that this interview airs, it will either be on the water to you or arrived in certain ports. Europe is probably going to get it a little bit before the United States in a rare twist of events, but that's how it happens sometimes. But hopefully, folks will have it within the month or two of this airing. And if you're interested in playing it, you can play it right now on Tabletop Simulator. We have the final version of the game up there. And we have been, at Leader, we are very transparent with all of our development processes as much as we possibly can be. And so if you're interested in our games, you can play them right now. And if you're looking for players, you can just Google the Woodland Warriors Discord, which has kind of become the official Leader Games Discord. There are like probably 2 or 3 games of Root that happen every day on that Discord, and a game of Oath about every day too. So you can go find a game right now if you'd like.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Cole. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, Matt. And I'll say that anybody who's interested in our work should absolutely follow us at Leader Games on Twitter. And I'm also at Cole Wehrle. I'm also at Cole Wehrle at Twitter. My Twitter feed is just game stuff I'm working on. So if you just want to hear me ramble about design, that's the place to go for it.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully if they've watched this far, that's exactly what they're in for. So I can imagine there'll be a number of interested people. Again, I've been Matt Jarvis. I'm from Dicebreaker. You can find us at dicebreaker.com, youtube.com/Dicebreaker, and at Join Dicebreaker on Twitter. We play board games. We play tabletop RPGs. Sometimes we squabble about them too, but we're a nice bunch. Come and join us.
It's a good website.